It's January 29, 2012, and this is a makeup lecture for Philosophy 3 Aesthetics on Plato's philosophy of art. I'm not feeling well, so please forgive the voice quality. So we saw last time in Philosophy 3 that Plato's version of the nature of the world is somewhat unintuitive for us. At the top of the universe and the most real thing in the world is God. God has the idea of everything: horse, car, chair, bed, human, mountain. All of these ideas exist in heaven, and they exist whether or not anything physical exists in the world. On the other hand, there are earthly objects, and earthly objects exist for Plato just in case they instantiate or they are a representation of the eternal form. So a chair is a chair just in case it's made in the image of a chair, or a buffalo is a buffalo rather than a deer just in case it follows that idea or that form of the buffalo rather than the form of the deer. So because the ideas for Plato are real, and the ideas describe the characteristics in virtue of which something can even have an identity as an object on earth, for Plato it's the ideas which are ultimately real. The simple, temporary, passing away, imperfect things on earth can never approximate the idea, and so they are for Plato unintuitively less real than the things as they exist in heaven, or the realm of ideas. We should remind ourselves that when we use the word heaven here, we're not using it directly in the sense of, let's say, a Christian heaven. It's a much more formal idea than that, and Plato exists about 600 years before the birth of Christ. So don't confuse the idea of the realm of ideas and God directly with something like we see there. So we've said that orders of reality go like this. There's a real and eternal, and that exists only in heaven, or the realm of the forms, the realm of the ideas. And then there are things on earth, and they exist only because God makes them possible. God, and in some sense for Plato, God sort of contains, or all the rest of the ideas, the eternal ideas, emanate from God or from the one divine source, and from those ideas come the ordinary objects on earth. We talked about mountains and beds and how they exist in virtue of, for the mountains, approximating the form of a mountain. And the basic form of a mountain is something just like a land formation that protrudes beyond something that we consider to be a valley, or the idea of the bed, which is just a good place for human beings to sleep. In the case of the bed, we said that maybe intuitively it makes a bit more sense for us to say that something is a bed just because the idea behind the bed is for us to sleep in it. Alright, so this is where we left off last time. And if you did the reading, you remember that Plato does quite a bit of talking about the bed and the bed maker and the relationship to the artist. So Plato has his interlocutor in the dialogue here talking about the bed and the bed maker and the artist. And the entire discussion starts with a discussion of imitation. And Socrates is convinced that, and he's reflecting Plato's idea here, that artists are imitators, and for that reason they have little value for the state, and little value for culture, little value for our lives. And so, in the dialogue, Socrates says, well, consider, for example, a bed maker. A bed maker doesn't have the idea of the bed, right? The big idea. That exists in heaven. That's God's idea. But a bed maker can at least make a bed. It's imperfect. It's never going to be as good as the ideal of the bed, right? Any bed that you sleep on, you're going to think, well, it could be a little bit more comfortable if. But at least the bed that the bed maker makes is useful. We need beds. But Plato says there is some, speaking as Socrates here, there is some great magician excuse me, who makes not only beds, but this magician can make bed makers, he can make gods, and he can make anything that anyone else can make. So at first, we have Socrates' interlocutor being pretty impressed with the idea that there's someone who can make not just one thing, like a bed maker might specialize in, but anything, including the gods. But of course, ultimately, he's not going to be a very impressive creature, because this most talented creature who can make anything at all is the artist. And Socrates brings up the idea that the artist can, in some sense, make anything at all because, like Homer, the great tragic poet, he can represent people doing anything at all. So he can make beds, he can make civilizations, he can make battles, he can talk about strategies of war and strategies of medicine and strategies of politics. In some sense, seems to be the most powerful and creative person in the world because they can create everything that makes up life and makes up society. But as you know from the reading, ultimately Socrates is going to say that this magician is a fraud and that he is 3 removes from the truth. So why 3 removes from the truth? Well, as we saw, the bed itself that the ordinary bed maker makes is only a poor approximation of the idea of a bed. And then the artist creates an image of that bed. So let's talk about what that looks like. So we know there's the original bed. That's God's idea of the bed. There's also the bed that a craftsman makes. There's the bed as it appears to a viewer. In other words, there's a sense in which when I look at the real bed, I represent to myself only one angle or one aspect of that bed. And then because Plato has in mind here especially someone like a poet or a painter, the painter represents just the bed as it appears to a person. So you end up with 3 removes from the truth, right? The truth is the idea of the bed. The craftsman, the bed maker, tries to make a bed and he makes at least a usable bed. The individual who tries to look and understand that bed gets a representation of that bed from a certain angle, looking in a certain way. And then the artist uses that representation, the way the bed looks to him, to create a representation of the way the bed looks to him. And so Plato's going to say, the artist's representation is the farthest thing from the truth. So obviously the reason that the artist can create anything at all is because he creates these things only as they appear and not as they really are. So the great magician is something of a fraud because his creation is not legitimate. It's a representation only, and sort of an impoverished representation. Plato compares it to someone who might take a mirror and hold a mirror up to something to create an image of what was there. And he points out that he's not very impressed by that because it's sort of not the same thing as creating the world, it's just reflecting it. So the value of art then for Plato is going to be somewhere between little and none. Why? Because sometimes art inspires us to be good, but more often it inspires sympathy for flawed people. So you remember that Plato thinks that our world down here, below heaven, below the realm of ideas, is a pretty messed up place. And anything, whether it's a bed or human action or nature itself, is a poor imitation of the true idea of what everything could be if it wasn't limited by being in this physical form, in this physical world. So Plato wants us to think about the higher things, about God and goodness and virtue and duty and even mathematics, which he sees as ideas that are eternal. He doesn't want us to be looking down here on earth. Looking to heaven and not looking to earth is what Plato wants us to do. But art, in Plato's view, whether it's poetry, painting, tragedy, gets us looking at human beings and the things that humans do, or at nature around us. So it can inspire sympathy for flawed people because, for example, if I watch a really good tragedy, I see bad people doing bad things and getting punished for it. But the tragedy is only going to be a good tragedy if I feel sympathy for the characters who are suffering. So let's say I watch a movie with a gangster who is a bad person who does bad things to bad people. The story will be completely uninteresting unless the story involves a person for whom we understand why he did the evil things he did, and we at least somewhat empathize with that character. We think something like, oh yeah, maybe if I was in that situation, if I had to defend my family's honor, or I had to make enough money for my family, then I would do the things that this evil gangster did. But Plato thinks that's exactly the opposite of how we should be thinking. If we feel sympathy for these flawed characters, then we're more likely to think, okay, well, I guess the separation between good and evil, which is really important for Plato, is not as concrete as we thought. Plato worries that that's going to corrupt us as individuals and also corrupt the state, corrupt our culture. And the second point, which we've already pointed out at length, is that because art is an imitation, no real knowledge is gained from this. We should go right to the true thing, right? So if I want to learn about beds, don't go to an artist who painted a picture of a bed. At least go look at the bed for yourself, or become a bed maker, or even better than that, think about what the idea of the bed is and understand it sort of intellectually. And for Plato, that's the best form of understanding. Plato gives the example of Homer and says that Homer, the great tragic poet, writes about things like governing, heroics, and medicine. But, says Plato, if Homer really knew about all these things, then he would go out there and be a hero. He would have ruled a state, or people would have ruled a state using his principles, and he would have just gone out there and cured people if he really understood medicine. So, is there any such thing as good art for Plato? Well, the best kind of art for Plato is art that holds a mirror to nature, so that at least we can accurately represent the world the way it is. Of course, it's not going to be completely accurately. It's going to be sort of an image of an image, but at least it, let's say in the case of painting, looks like the thing I'm trying to paint. Plato also had at least a little bit of sympathy for art that inspires good action. So rather than, let's say, a tragic film that told about a non-savory character who does bad things that we understand, Plato would rather stories of, let's say, heroes going around and doing the right thing all the time, so that we can learn to at least be inspired by that kind of good action. So I'm going on now to the next sheet, and this is the sheet that I emailed you as a PDF and a doc file, so you should be able to print that out. I suppose you could even use the doc file to take your notes directly if you wanted to. So I want to say a little bit about how Plato and Aristotle differed in relationship to each other and to their take on art. Interestingly, while Plato himself, at least according to his own account, was a poet before Socrates convinced him to become a philosopher, Plato's student, Aristotle, was more scientifically minded, but from that scientific mindset he actually found a value for art in society that Plato didn't see. So we remember that for Plato, ideas such as a horse or a human are the kind of things that make the object possible. Aristotle wants to exactly reverse this and say, we only have the idea of a horse because there are real horses in the world, and when we look at the horses in the world, we say, oh, horses have nice long ears, strong legs, pointy snout, and manes, and so we get the idea of the horse for Aristotle from the real horses themselves. So for Plato, the existence of the horse, that there are horses at all, is only possible because the idea of the horse already exists. And the more horse-like the real horse is, the better that horse is. Aristotle's going to say that there's no such thing as an idea of a horse or a form of a horse that's separate from just what horses have in common. So the idea that we have is taken from the form of a horse in a very ordinary sense, really. It's just the form that horses, in fact, come in. The form doesn't exist, the idea doesn't exist as some separate thing, except when we think of it from abstracting from the many horses that we see. Aristotle also makes the claim that we can learn from earthly things. Aristotle himself was a scientist when Alexander the Great, who he had tutored, Aristotle had, as a child, was going around the world conquering various lands. He actually sent specimens back to Aristotle to study, and Aristotle did a lot of some of the very earliest biological classification, some of the very earliest physics, biology, study of plants and other physical systems, physics even. And so Aristotle believed that, unlike Plato, who said you can only really learn from ignoring the corrupt physical world, Aristotle believed that we can learn a lot from just looking at the things around us, because that rational structure exists in the things themselves. So Aristotle was a big fan of actually studying nature, looking at nature closely and focusing on nature to learn from nature itself. Somewhere Aristotle gives the example of an acorn, and the idea that the acorn contains in itself the logical structure to create the mighty oak. So that logical structure, or the idea, if you will, the form of the oak tree, exists in the oak seed itself, not in some magical or otherworldly way, but just in the form of the seed. It's somehow within the seed itself, the ability to generate the oak tree. Thinking specifically about art, Aristotle makes the point that art can actually help us to learn. For example, painting copies of nature helps us to learn about nature. Especially before we had photographic reproduction, most textbooks that were teaching us how to understand nature did that by representing nature through painting or drawing. Drama was also really important in ancient Greece, and Aristotle makes the point that drama copies human nature to help us learn about human nature. So, where Plato would have seen a film like American Beauty, which is a bad person doing mostly bad things. In fact, almost every character is bad people doing mostly bad things. And Plato would have worried, well, these characters, though evil, are sympathetic, and it teaches you to have sympathy for evil people. We shouldn't have this kind of drama. Aristotle would say, well, no, if we watch the characters who are doing the wrong thing, and we understand their motivation for doing the wrong thing, we can learn something about our own character, our own tendencies, our own proclivities toward doing the wrong thing. We can understand why the character made bad choices, and we can learn from that to actually make good choices. So even watching bad people do bad things, if it's represented in a way that's believable, we can learn from that ideas about how to ourselves be virtuous. Aristotle also makes the point that some kinds of art, such as tragedy, which oftentimes shows the worst people doing the worst kinds of things, not only teach us not to do those things, but also provide for us a kind of experience which he refers to as catharsis. So catharsis is an experience that people have when they witness very negative events. But they're events that are not actually happening to them, right? They're events that are just represented, especially through something like tragedy. Oedipus is a good example of this because Oedipus is abandoned as a child. He ends up marrying his mother and killing his father. And whereas Plato would be horrified at the very idea of us watching such a story, Aristotle thinks that when we see these horrible things like sexuality and violence represented in a dramatic way, that we somehow experience a purgation of our fears, anxiety, and antisocial emotions. So the anger and the fear and the sexual frustration that's built up in us by having to live as good citizens, right? Good citizens can't be expressing their fear, anger, and sexual feelings anytime they occur. So it builds up in us on this view, and watching something like a tragedy can actually sort of, as we feel with the character, kind of empty us of those negative emotions and allow us to keep living as good citizens without that antisocial emotion building up. If it seems like sort of a Freudian idea, you're right. Freud takes the idea of catharsis, definitely derivatively of Aristotle's concept of catharsis as it exists in ancient philosophy. Now, a last thing to point out is that Plato is sometimes also seen as a friend to art. You remember that the early Plato was actually this poet who wanted to make beautiful art. And some of Plato's dialogues actually suggest that Plato could be considered a friend rather than an enemy of things like the beautiful and works of art. Probably the most often cited work of Plato for this argument is the Symposium. The Symposium by Plato is a dialogue where Plato, Socrates, and all Socrates' friends are hanging out and talking about beauty, and they're making poetic speeches to beauty and sort of having a contest. Socrates, of course, wins the contest, and ultimately Socrates ends up saying that true beauty is not physical beauty, which we expect him to say, but he actually says that physical beauty is important because it teaches us ultimately to look up towards heavenly beauty, and the highest heavenly beauty is the beauty of a good, virtuous, well-lived life that's seeking after divine and eternal things. But that's a process, and in that process, physical beauty is an important step. So when Socrates at the end of the work says, here's what I know, or was taught actually by this priestess about beauty, he says beauty follows this sort of path or this ladder towards virtue, and it works like this. Step number 1 on this path toward virtue, when being affected by beauty, is that Plato begins people start by being affected by people's physical beauty. Before they can see the beauty of a virtuous life, we're all predisposed to see physical beauty in people. When we see physical beauty in people, we want to be around those people. We can become obsessed with the physical beauty of people. And on Plato's view, this is not necessarily, at least as in the Symposium, this is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just an incomplete thing. what Plato is hoping is that the sensitivity to beauty in an individual person, once we've been around that person for a while and we realize that that beauty is more than what we saw in the person. Some of that beauty we were projecting upon the person, and the person themselves is just an incomplete, imperfect human being. That we'll begin to see, once awakened to beauty, beauty in everything. So at first, Plato thinks we'll be awakened by beauty as we see it in one individual person, but after that, we learn to see beauty in everything. You can imagine like those old films where the stodgy old man falls in love with some woman and walks home, and then there's beauty everywhere, and birds are flying, and everything's wonderful and beautiful. But Plato thinks that once we've been entranced by physical beauty of a person and started to see beauty everywhere, eventually we realize that human beauty is a general principle. It's an idea, and it's not the possession of any one person. Just like any bed is imperfect, any one person who we fall in love with is also going to be an imperfect person. But that original vision of beauty that we had, Plato thinks is something beyond just what we projected onto an individual person or an individual relationship. And so ultimately, Plato, speaking through Socrates here, says that if we're sensitive enough to the reality of beauty, we realize that the beauty we saw in another person is also a desire for ourselves to become the most beautiful thing that we can be. And, as luck would have it, the most beautiful thing we can be is beautiful, virtuous people seeking after divine beauty, which is outside of our world and eternal. And the truly beautiful life is a life where we spend time with other virtuous people trying to learn about divine beauty and not focusing on the physical beauty or the physical nature of the world. So hopefully you can see how this is, on the one hand, consistent with Plato's idea that we shouldn't focus on the physical world, and that things like beautiful art are just distracting us from the beautiful eternal things which are outside of our world. But how that idea could be consistent with an appreciation of art and beauty in general that says, oh, once you've been entranced by physically beautiful things like a beautiful painting, rather than desiring that painting or even a beautiful person, rather than desiring that person, ultimately what you're desiring is to find true beauty. True beauty is eternal. Nothing on earth is perfect like the eternal beauty that we seek. And so ultimately we seek divine goodness, knowledge, beauty. He even thinks things like scientific and mathematical objects are ultimately the most beautiful thing. But even a well-lived, virtuous human life is going to be one of the best ways to express a beautiful life here on earth. Now, it's worth mentioning, I suppose, a few objections to Plato's Symposium. One objection that's been raised frequently is the idea that Plato has this strong objection to some kinds of art, but he does see an appreciation for beauty as something like a link to morality. So beautiful people are somehow inspiring me to be beautiful. We can ask whether or not the objection I'm about to raise is really reflective of Plato's view, but many people have pointed out something that contemporary empirical psychologists have pointed out to us as a problem, which is that we tend to associate beauty and goodness much more than we should. These are obviously two characters from the Lord of the Rings series, and just by looking at them, I know which is the good and which is the bad person, who's the virtuous and who's the unvirtuous one. The beautiful one, by the contemporary standards of beauty, is going to be considered the good person, and the ugly one, the bad person. But how correct is it to associate beauty and goodness. A lot of problems get created by this association and by the psychological tendency we have to assume, and psychologists have shown that we really do in fact do this, that people who look nicer are actually better people than people who don't appeal to us as much. To what degree is Plato responsible for that? Well, at the very least we show that he thinks that our search for beauty, even physical beauty, somehow links us to ethics. Of course, the story is much more complex than that. You can decide whether or not you think it's a strong objection to Plato's view. Another objection to Plato's Symposium and the nature of beauty as it's presented there is the idea that someone might challenge Plato's claim through Socrates in the Symposium that beauty is really outside or beyond our world. Remember that Plato's willing to accept, let's say, the beauty that we find in another person or the beauty of a work of art just as sort of a stepping stone to realize that any person is ultimately going to let us down. They're not going to be beautiful or fully virtuous. And ultimately I kind of move past the appreciation of beauty that I find in this world for a higher form of beauty that's outside of our world. Some people have objected to this by saying, shouldn't we actually continue to find the things in our world beautiful and continue to appreciate the physical beauty around us all of the time, rather than constantly saying, oh, well, that's a beautiful person or a beautiful tree, but ultimately beauty is found not in the physical world around us, but outside of it. If I'm the kind of person who wants to live experiencing the beautiful things, let's say, that nature provides, then you might object to the idea that any beauty I see is just pointing to something that can never be approached but is outside of our world. Alright, that ends our makeup lecture for Philosophy 3. This was recorded on January 29th, 2015 to make up for a day when I was sick 2 days in a row. Thank you for listening. I will see you in class soon.